The old car rolled into the hotel drive like a rumor nobody wanted to believe. Its paint had faded to a dull silver, scratched along one door, the kind of car that belonged in a parking lot behind a hardware store, not beneath the glass towers of an executive summit. Valets in pressed uniforms stared. A line of Mercedes sedans and Porsche coupes waited behind it, engines humming with quiet impatience, as if the old car itself were an insult to the evening. Inside sat Gideon Mercer, 41 years old, hands steady on the wheel, eyes calm behind the windshield. He did not rush. He did not apologize. He simply parked, stepped out, and closed the door with the same unhurried confidence of a man who had never once needed anyone's approval. Laughter broke first, sharp and sudden, from a small circle of executives near the entrance. At the center of it stood Celeste Vaughn, 37 years old, chief executive of Vaughn Meridian Holdings, dressed in tailored black, her heels striking the marble with the rhythm of someone who owned every room she entered. She looked at the car, then at the man walking away from it, and let a slow, cutting smile spread across her face. "Someone like you dares to show up here," she said, loud enough for a dozen people to hear. A few of them laughed with her. Gideon did not turn around. He walked past the fountain, past the velvet ropes, and into the lobby, as if the words had never reached him at all. The Executive Investment Summit had been billed for months as the most exclusive gathering of the season, an evening reserved for the kind of people whose decisions moved entire markets before breakfast. Chandeliers hung low over the entrance hall, throwing soft gold light across a sea of tailored suits and polished shoes, while waiters in white gloves carried trays of champagne between clusters of men and women trading names and numbers like currency of their own. Every guest arriving that night understood the unspoken rule of the evening, that appearance was leverage, that the car in the drive and the watch on the wrist spoke before a single word ever left anyone's mouth. Against that backdrop, the faded silver car looked less like an oversight and more like a quiet act of rebellion, though no one in that crowd yet understood it as such. Celeste hated being ignored more than she hated being challenged. She followed him with her eyes as he crossed the marble floor, waiting for some flicker of embarrassment that never came. Most men in his position, arriving in a car like that, wearing a blazer that had clearly seen a decade of wear, would have shrunk under the weight of a room like this one. Gideon did neither. He walked with the posture of someone who had already decided the opinions circling him meant nothing, and that unbothered calm irritated her more than any insult could have. She turned to the woman beside her, an assistant clutching a tablet, and murmured that someone should check the guest list because a man like that had no business inside an investment summit of this caliber. At the reception desk, Gideon slid a small card toward the attendant. There was no title printed on it, no company logo, no long string of credentials meant to impress a stranger, just a name and 3 words beneath it. Gideon Mercer, it read, Especial Principal. The attendant glanced at the card twice, then looked up at him with a flicker of confusion, because the name meant nothing to her, and yet something about the phrasing made her hesitate before waving him through. Gideon thanked her quietly and walked toward the ballroom where the summit was already underway, unaware or entirely indifferent to the fact that Celeste Vaughn was still watching him from across the lobby. Arms crossed, jaw tight, certain that she had already understood exactly who he was. She had not understood anything at all. What no one in that lobby knew was that Gideon Mercer had spent nearly 2 decades building something almost no one could see. He had trained as a financial engineer before becoming a corporate strategist, the kind of mind that noticed patterns other analysts missed entirely, the kind of instinct that turned modest capital into structures worth hundreds of millions of dollars. A marriage that had ended painfully years earlier had taught him something he never forgot. Recognition was fragile, attention was dangerous, and the quieter a man moved through the world, the more freedom he actually had. He avoided luxury cars because luxury cars invited eyes, and eyes invited assumptions. And assumptions were exactly the kind of leverage he preferred his rivals never to have. There had been a season of his life, years earlier, when the modesty had not been a strategy at all, but simply the truth of his circumstances. A period after the marriage ended, when he had raised his household alone, and counted every dollar with a care most of his current peers would never understand. That chapter had shaped him in ways no business school ever could, teaching him patience, restraint, and a quiet suspicion of anyone who mistook noise for substance. He rarely spoke of those years to anyone, not out of shame, but because he had never seen the point in explaining a foundation to people who only cared about the building standing on top of it. He avoided cameras. He avoided galas. He avoided the glossy magazine profiles that so many of his peers chased the way children chased fireflies, desperate to be seen, desperate to be believed important. Gideon built his network through private holding companies and layered partnerships, structures so deliberately fragmented that even seasoned analysts rarely connected the threads back to a single name. Few people outside a small circle of trusted partners understood that the quiet man in the worn blazer sat, in one form or another, behind pieces of banking, logistics, energy, and technology worth more than most people could imagine in a lifetime. To the world, he was simply a man who lived modestly. To the handful who truly knew him, he was something else entirely. Inside the ballroom, the summit had already begun, and Celeste stood at the head of the table, outlining a technology acquisition worth hundreds of millions of dollars. A deal she had spent 8 months assembling. Gideon took a seat near the far end, unnoticed by most of the room, listening far more than he spoke. The other executives assumed he was a minor investor invited out of courtesy, the kind of guest who nodded along and signed whatever was placed in front of him. Celeste barely glanced his way until she noticed he had not touched his copy of the deal memo once, had not scribbled a single note, had simply watched the numbers scroll across the screen with an expression she could not quite read. "Mr. Mercer," she finally said, her voice carrying just enough edge to draw attention. "Do you actually understand the scale of what we are discussing here?" The room quieted. Gideon lifted his eyes from the screen and met hers without hesitation. "I understand enough to know it is being valued incorrectly," he said. The silence that followed was different from the laughter in the lobby. This silence had weight. Celeste's jaw tightened, and she demanded proof, certain that whatever came next would collapse under scrutiny. Gideon simply nodded toward the projector and said one sentence that would change the tone of the entire evening. "Before we go further, someone should open page 47. A junior analyst fumbled through the printed report, flipping pages with trembling hands while the room watched in tense silence. When he finally reached page 47, his face went pale, and he looked up at the chief financial officer beside him instead of speaking aloud. The number on that page did not match a single figure anywhere else in the deal. Celeste leaned forward, her earlier confidence beginning to crack at the edges, and asked what exactly the analyst was seeing. He turned the laptop toward her without a word. And for the first time that evening, the woman who had mocked a stranger's car in the lobby felt something colder settle in her chest, an unfamiliar and unwelcome doubt. Around the table, executives who moments earlier had been checking their phones now leaned forward, drawn into a silence that felt almost physical. Someone whispered a question about whether the audit firm responsible for the original figures could be held liable, and someone else murmured back that liability was the least of anyone's concerns at that particular moment. Celeste's assistant, still holding the tablet she had suggested checking the guest list with hours earlier, now stared at her employer with an expression caught somewhere between alarm and disbelief. The mood of the entire room had inverted itself so completely that it seemed almost impossible this was the same gathering that had opened with laughter in a hotel drive less than 2 hours before. The room shifted from amusement to unease within a matter of minutes. Gideon walked the executives through what the discrepancy actually meant, speaking slowly, choosing each word with the precision of a surgeon rather than a showman. Revenue figures had been inflated across 2 fiscal quarters. A significant debt obligation had been quietly excluded from the summary documents. Buried inside a supplementary contract sat a cancellation clause that would allow the target company's largest client to walk away within 90 days of acquisition, a detail that would have gutted the entire valuation the moment the ink dried. Celeste's carefully built case, the deal she had staked her reputation on, was unraveling in front of 24 witnesses. "Where did you get this information?" she demanded, her voice tighter now. less certain of its own authority. Gideon looked at her evenly. "I read the things other people choose to skip," he said. A senior executive named Malcolm Rourke, 52 years old and visibly agitated, rose from his seat and accused Gideon of trying to sabotage the acquisition for reasons of his own, insisting that no outside investor should be allowed to derail a deal this significant on the basis of a single overlooked page. Gideon did not raise his voice. He simply continued laying out inconsistency after inconsistency, each one more damning than the last, while Malcolm's protests grew louder and less convincing with every passing minute. By the time the meeting adjourned, something in Celeste had shifted, though she was not yet willing to admit it even to herself. She caught up with Gideon in the hallway outside the ballroom, her heels echoing against the marble, and asked him directly who he actually was. "A man who does not enjoy paying for things that are not worth their price," he answered. She reminded him, almost involuntarily, of the comment she had made about his car in front of a dozen strangers. Gideon studied her for a long moment before responding. "You still believe a car tells you a person's worth?" he said. "It usually does," she replied, though her voice carried less conviction than it had an hour earlier. "Then tonight," he said, "you are going to learn something." The lobby erupted into motion only minutes later, when a security officer rushed toward the ballroom entrance, breathless, announcing that a black Ferrari had just pulled up outside, and that the man stepping out of it was asking for someone named Mercer. Every head in the lobby turned toward the glass doors, as the Ferrari's engine cut into silence outside. Executives who moments earlier had been trading business cards froze mid-conversation, drawn instead to the sleek black car, gleaming under the entrance lights. A man stepped out, perhaps 50 years old, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit with the precision of something tailored abroad, his presence commanding attention before he had even crossed the threshold. Celeste recognized him instantly. His name was Alistair Kane, executive chairman of one of the largest private investment funds in the world, a man whose signature alone could move markets, a man she had spent years hoping to meet in person. She assumed, naturally, that he had come for her. That word of Von Meridian's ambitious acquisition had somehow reached the highest levels of international finance and drawn him here tonight. She straightened her posture, smoothed the front of her blazer, and stepped forward to greet him with the kind of practiced warmth she reserved for people who mattered. Alistair walked past her without a glance. His eyes were fixed somewhere beyond her shoulder, locked onto a figure standing quietly near the far wall, in a worn blazer and scuffed shoes. A man most of the room had already dismissed, hours earlier. Whispers rippled through the lobby as Alistair crossed the marble floor directly toward Gideon. He stopped a few feet away, and then, to the disbelief of everyone watching, lowered his head in a small, unmistakable bow. He extended his hand, his voice clear enough for the entire room to hear. "Chairman," he said, "everything is ready." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward through a lobby full of people who suddenly could not stop staring. Celeste felt her stomach drop, certain she had misheard him, certain there was some mistake unfolding in front of her eyes. "Chairman," she repeated aloud, unable to stop herself. Alistair turned toward her, genuine surprise crossing his face. "You do not know?" he asked, as though the question itself were absurd. Gideon said nothing at first, only spoke his old friend's name quietly, a single word that carried a clear and unmistakable warning. "Alistair," he said. That was enough. Alistair straightened immediately, understanding at once that his old friend had no interest in being exposed in a room full of strangers, that whatever anonymity Gideon had built for himself was something he intended to protect a little longer, even now. But the moment had already cracked something open that could not be closed again. A young analyst near the back of the crowd pulled out her phone, not to record anything scandalous, but simply to search a name that suddenly felt important. She typed Gideon Mercer into a financial database her firm used for due diligence, the same database Celeste's own team relied on for background checks before every major transaction. Within seconds, a single line of text appeared on the screen that made her go completely still. She turned the phone toward her colleague without a word, and the whisper that followed spread through the lobby faster than anyone could contain. Celeste, sensing the shift in the room around her, pulled out her own phone with trembling fingers. She searched the same name, her thumb hovering nervously over the screen as the results loaded. What appeared was not a headline or a gossip column, but a confidential filing buried deep in an obscure regulatory database, the kind of document reserved for institutional investors and legal teams, never intended for casual searching. At the top of the filing sat a company name she had never once encountered in 8 years of doing business, followed by a single line that made the blood drain from her face entirely. Mercer Capital Group, it read. Founder, G. Mercer. Celeste stood frozen in the middle of the lobby, phone still glowing in her hand, while around her, the room she had walked into with such certainty just hours earlier seemed to rearrange itself into something she no longer recognized. Small conversations broke out in nervous clusters around her. Executives leaning toward one another with hushed questions about who had actually invited Gideon Mercer to the summit in the first place, and whether anyone present had any real relationship with him at all. Malcolm Rourke stood near the bar, his drink untouched, watching the scene unfold with an expression that had shifted from irritation to something closer to calculation. He had spent the entire evening trying to undermine a man he assumed carried no real weight in the room, and now understood, with visible discomfort, that his assumption may have cost him more than his pride. Over the following days, Celeste could not let the name go. She dug through every filing she could access, cross-referencing subsidiaries and shell entities late into the night, piecing together a structure so deliberately fragmented that most investigators would have given up long before reaching the center of it. What she found unsettled her more with every hour. Mercer Capital was not a modest fund quietly managing a handful of portfolios. It was a vast and largely invisible network, holding significant stakes in banking institutions, technology firms, logistics conglomerates, commercial real estate, and energy infrastructure, spread across ownership structures so layered that tracing them back to a single controlling name required a level of access few outsiders ever possessed. Gideon held control through interlocking trusts and holding companies, a labyrinth built not for concealment of wrongdoing, but for the simple preservation of privacy in a world that treated visible wealth as an invitation for exploitation. Celeste discovered something even more startling buried within the filings. Several of the largest and most recognizable companies in the country had, at some point, quietly sought Gideon's backing during moments of crisis, meeting with him in private rooms, far from any press attention. Chief executives whose faces regularly appeared on the covers of business publications had sat across from this same unassuming man, asking for the kind of capital and counsel that could rescue or destroy their companies entirely. One filing described a struggling logistics company on the brink of collapse 3 years earlier, a company whose name Celeste recognized immediately because it now employed thousands of people and dominated its regional market. The founder of that company had apparently met Gideon in a modest diner rather than a boardroom, had laid out the company's failures with total honesty, and had walked away with both funding and a restructuring plan that saved every job on the payroll. There was no press release attached to the deal, no announcement, no photograph. It had simply happened, quietly, the way Gideon seemed to prefer everything happened. She thought back, again and again, to the comments she had made in the hotel drive, the laughter she had encouraged, the casual cruelty of dismissing a man based entirely on the paint of his car. Shame settled into her chest, slowly, uninvited, the kind that did not fade with time but instead deepened the longer she sat with it. And yet, as she read further, she began to understand something else about Gideon Mercer that complicated the picture even more. He had never used his name to intimidate anyone. He had never flaunted the empire quietly humming beneath his ownership. He simply chose, deliberately and repeatedly, to remain invisible. Gideon had watched too many talented people get dismissed before they ever had a chance to prove themselves, judged by a suit, a car, a zip code, or an accent rather than the substance of their work. He had decided long ago that he would rather be underestimated than worshipped, that anonymity gave him a clarity about people's true character that wealth and visibility never could. Celeste finally worked up the nerve to seek him out privately, away from boardrooms and lobbies and the eyes of strangers. In a quiet corner office overlooking the city skyline, for the first time since they had met, There was no arrogance in her posture, only a kind of uncertain humility she was not used to wearing. "Why did you even come to that meeting?" she asked him, her voice quieter than it had ever been in his presence. Gideon considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I came to decide whether your company deserved to be saved," he said. The words struck her harder than she expected. "Saved," she repeated, the question catching in her throat. Gideon reached into a leather folder and slid a small stack of documents across the desk toward her, without another word, watching her expression carefully as she began to read. Her eyes moved across the first page, and within seconds, the color drained slowly from her face. The documents outlined, in precise and damning detail, that Von Meridian Holdings was on the verge of losing control over one of its most critical assets entirely, a vulnerability so severe that it threatened to unravel everything she had spent over a decade building. The problem, Gideon explained carefully, was not market volatility or poor timing or bad luck. It was deliberate. Someone inside Von Meridian had been manipulating internal data for months, quietly altering figures in ways subtle enough to avoid detection during routine audits, but significant enough to obscure a growing and dangerous exposure. Celeste's mind immediately jumped to Malcolm Rourke, the executive who had so vehemently opposed Gideon during the summit, the man who had accused him of trying to sabotage the acquisition in front of dozens of witnesses. Gideon, however, refused to draw conclusions without proof, insisting instead on an independent forensic audit before anyone's name was attached to blame. It was in that decision, more than anything else, that Celeste began to genuinely trust him. She had expected a man in his position to move quickly, decisively, perhaps even ruthlessly, using his resources to seize control of a vulnerable company the way so many predators in this industry would have. Instead, Gideon insisted on patience, on evidence, on fairness, even toward a man who had publicly maligned him. She agreed to cooperate fully, granting his team access to internal systems she had never before shared with an outsider. And the two of them began working side by side late into the night, poring over transaction logs and audit trails that stretched back years. Their relationship, once defined entirely by contempt on her part and quiet indifference on his, began to shift into something neither of them had anticipated. Gideon rarely raised his voice, rarely needed to. He commanded a room not through dominance, but through precision, through the simple, disarming weight of always being right about the things that mattered. Celeste found herself watching him differently now, noticing the careful way he treated everyone from the junior analysts to the security staff, noticing that his quiet confidence had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with genuine self-assurance. Late one evening, deep into a review of encrypted transaction records, Gideon uncovered a chain of transfers routed through several shell companies designed specifically to obscure their final destination. It had taken his forensic team nearly a week to trace the money back through 4 separate jurisdictions, each layer designed to discourage exactly the kind of investigation now unfolding. Each shell entity had been registered under a slightly different variation of an innocuous name, the kind of paperwork designed to bore an investigator into skimming past it, rather than reading closely, and Gideon's team had cross-referenced registration dates against internal calendar records to prove the timing was no coincidence. The final transfer alone accounted for an amount large enough to destabilize an entire fiscal quarter if it had gone unnoticed for even a few more weeks. When the final signature appeared on the screen, authorizing the last and largest of the suspicious transfers, Celeste leaned forward to read the name attached to it, certain there had been some mistake in the documentation. She stared at the screen for a long moment, her expression hollowing out completely, before finally speaking, in a voice barely above a whisper. "That cannot be right," she said. "This person has worked beside me for 12 years. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything Celeste had ever presided over in her career. She called the individual into her office alone at first, hoping for some explanation, some reasonable defense that would make the evidence in front of her disappear. Instead, she received denial after denial, each one more desperate and less convincing than the last, until the silence between accusations grew heavier than any words could have. Malcolm Rourke, sensing the walls closing in around the situation, attempted once again to redirect suspicion toward Gideon. insisting loudly to anyone who would listen that the entire audit had been engineered from the start to justify a hostile takeover. An emergency board meeting was called within days, the largest gathering of shareholders Von Meridian had assembled in years, tension thick enough to feel the moment the doors closed. Malcolm stood before the room and accused Gideon openly, his voice rising with practiced outrage, insisting that a man with no formal position at the company had no right to dictate its future. "He is trying to seize control of everything you built," Malcolm said, gesturing toward Celeste as murmurs of uncertainty rippled through the gathered shareholders, several of whom exchanged nervous, doubtful glances. Gideon did not immediately defend himself. He let the accusations hang in the air, watching Malcolm carefully, allowing the room to sit with its own uncertainty a moment longer. Then the doors opened, and Alistair Kane walked in flanked by a small legal team carrying sealed folders, each one containing documentation that could not be disputed or dismissed. Bank records, signed authorizations, and encrypted transfer logs were projected onto the screen one after another, forming an unbroken chain of evidence that led directly back to deliberate manipulation orchestrated from within Von Meridian's own walls. Several board members who had loudly supported Malcolm's accusations only minutes earlier now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding his eyes entirely as the evidence mounted. One older shareholder, a man who had sat on the board since the company's founding, removed his glasses and rubbed his temples, muttering that he had trusted Malcolm's judgment on financial matters for over a decade without ever once questioning it. The silence that followed his comment was heavier than any accusation Malcolm had thrown earlier in the meeting. Malcolm's protests grew thinner with every document displayed, his composure cracking visibly under the weight of proof no clever argument could talk its way around. And yet, even as the room turned against him, Gideon offered him one final chance to speak honestly, to explain himself without further deception. After a long, heavy silence, Malcolm finally admitted the truth, his voice quiet and defeated in a way it had never been before. He confessed that he had manipulated a portion of the company's finances, convinced that Celeste's trust in her longtime colleagues would keep her from ever looking closely enough to notice. Celeste sat perfectly still as the confession unfolded in front of the entire board, feeling something inside her collapse under the weight of it. It was not only the betrayal that devastated her, but the slow, sickening realization that her own pride, her own certainty that she could read people and control every outcome, had created exactly the kind of blind spot someone else had been patient enough to exploit. Gideon did not gloat. He did not offer a single word of mockery or triumph. He simply looked at her and said, quietly enough that only she truly absorbed it, "Leadership is not about never making mistakes. It is about having the courage to face them honestly." Celeste rose from her seat before the entire board could adjourn, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, and announced a decision that could very well cost her the position she had spent her entire career building. She told the board everything, holding nothing back, laying out every failure of oversight that had allowed the manipulation to continue undetected for as long as it had. She did not attempt to soften her own responsibility as chief executive, did not shift blame towards subordinates or external pressures the way so many in her position might have chosen to do. Instead, she accepted full accountability in front of every shareholder in the room, knowing full well that several members of the board had already begun quietly discussing whether she should be removed from her role entirely. Her voice did not waver as she spoke, though her hands remained clasped tightly in front of her the entire time. A small tell that betrayed exactly how much the moment cost her. She told the board that a chief executive who could not admit her own blind spots had no right leading a company built on the trust of thousands of employees and shareholders alike. Some board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unprepared for this kind of candor from a woman they had only ever seen project total control. Others, quietly, began to nod, recognizing in her honesty something they had rarely encountered in years of boardroom politics and careful deflection. It was, without question, the most difficult moment of her professional life. Gideon could have taken control of Von Meridian in that instant, with almost no resistance at all. His resources, his credibility, and the damning evidence now on record gave him every advantage he would have needed to seize the company outright. restructure it under his own name, and walk away with a controlling stake that would have made headlines across the industry. He chose not to. Instead, he stood before the same board and proposed something entirely different, an offer that stunned nearly everyone in the room, including Celeste herself, who had braced for the worst possible outcome only moments earlier. He proposed a plan to stabilize Von Meridian financially, to keep Celeste in her position as chief executive, and to rebuild the company's governance structure from the ground up, closing the very gaps that had allowed Malcolm's deception to flourish undetected for so long. "Why are you helping me?" Celeste asked him later that evening, once the board meeting had finally ended and the two of them stood alone in the emptied conference room. "Because you changed," Gideon answered simply. "Only because I apologized," she pressed, still searching for some deeper motive behind his generosity. "No," he said. "Because you took responsibility." That distinction settled over her slowly, and she understood, perhaps for the first time, exactly what he meant. Her mind drifted back, unbidden, to that first evening in the hotel drive, to the sound of her own laughter ringing out across the courtyard as she mocked a man for the car he drove. She had judged him entirely by what he owned rather than who he was, and in doing so had revealed far more about her own character than his. Gideon, watching the realization settle across her face, offered a small confession of his own. Something he had never explained to anyone outside his closest circle. He told her that he kept the old car deliberately, not out of frugality or nostalgia, but as a constant reminder to himself that worth was never measured by appearance. Every time he climbed behind that worn steering wheel, he was reminded of who he had been before any of the wealth, before any of the influence, and it kept him grounded in a way no amount of money ever could. Celeste laughed then, quietly and genuinely, the first real laugh she had allowed herself in what felt like weeks. The tension between them eased into something lighter, something neither of them had expected to find in the wreckage of a corporate scandal. Before she left the building that night, Gideon extended an invitation that surprised her far more than anything that had come before it. He asked her to join a new venture he was quietly assembling, not as an employee or a client, but as a full partner. Months passed, and Von Meridian slowly recovered from the scandal that had nearly ended it. The governance failures Malcolm had exploited were rebuilt from the foundation up, layered with independent oversight and transparency measures that made a repeat of his deception nearly impossible. Celeste emerged from the ordeal a different executive entirely, one who listened more than she spoke, who no longer measured people by the surface details that had once shaped her every first impression. She caught herself, more than once, pausing before judging a new hire or a hesitant investor, remembering exactly how wrong she had once been about a man in a worn blazer and an old scratched car. Gideon continued driving the same Oldsmobile, unchanged and unbothered by everything that had unfolded since that first evening. At a corporate gathering months later, held in the very same hotel where the story had begun, people recognized him the moment he stepped through the doors. This time, no laughter followed him across the marble floor. Executives who had once dismissed him without a second glance now approached with quiet respect, some extending handshakes, others simply nodding in acknowledgement of a man whose name now carried weight in rooms he rarely bothered to enter. A young associate, newly hired and still unfamiliar with the full weight of the story, worked up the courage to ask him directly why the chairman still drove a car like that when he could afford virtually anything else in the world. Gideon considered the question for a moment, then answered simply that he had bought it with his own money, at a time when it was all he could afford, and saw no reason to abandon something that had never once failed him. Laughter rippled through the small crowd gathered nearby, warm and genuine this time, nothing like the mockery of months earlier. Celeste stood beside him, watching the exchange with quiet amusement of her own. "And because he does not need a car to prove who he is," she added, her voice carrying easily across the gathered group. The words landed differently coming from her, a woman who had once built her entire judgment of a stranger around exactly that assumption. Over the months that followed, the relationship between Gideon and Celeste deepened gradually, moving at its own unhurried pace, built not on spectacle but on something steadier. Their colleagues noticed the change before either of them ever acknowledged it aloud. The way Celeste's schedule seemed to leave more room for late meetings that ran past sunset, the way Gideon, a man famous for guarding his time above almost everything else, began appearing at Von Meridian's offices without any formal reason listed on his calendar at all. There was no dramatic declaration, no sweeping gesture meant to announce what was growing between them. It revealed itself instead in small, quiet moments. Late evenings spent reviewing reports together. Unguarded conversations that stretched long after business had concluded, a mutual respect that slowly softened into something warmer neither of them rushed to name. Celeste found herself looking forward to those evenings more than she cared to admit. Drawn not to his wealth or his influence, but to the steady, unshakable calm he carried into every room he entered, a calm she was only beginning to understand had been earned through years of quiet discipline. One evening, as they stood together in the underground garage beneath Gideon's private office, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a second set of keys, sliding them into her palm without ceremony. "I think it is time you understood who that Ferrari actually belongs to," he said quietly, watching her expression shift with curiosity. Celeste turned the keys over in her hand, studying the unfamiliar emblem stamped into the metal, waiting for Gideon to explain. He told her, finally, that the Ferrari Alistair had arrived in that first night had never been a personal possession at all. It belonged to the Mercer Capital Fleet, reserved for rare occasions requiring a certain visible presence, brought out only when circumstances demanded exactly that kind of unmistakable arrival. Alistair had used it that evening not out of vanity, but because urgent news needed to reach Gideon immediately, and speed had mattered more than subtlety in that particular moment. Gideon himself had never once driven it, had never felt the slightest pull toward the kind of attention a car like that inevitably attracted. He had built an empire vast enough to own a fleet of vehicles most people would spend a lifetime never affording, and yet he continued, without hesitation, to choose the same weathered Oldsmobile every single morning. Celeste finally understood the full weight of what he had been trying to teach her from the very first night they met, a lesson far deeper than any spreadsheet or boardroom strategy could have delivered on its own. The two of them walked together toward the parking level reserved for Gideon's own vehicle, passing rows of gleaming sedans and imported sports cars without a second glance. There, parked quietly at the end of the row, sat the same faded Oldsmobile that had once drawn laughter and scorn from an entire hotel courtyard. Gideon opened the door for her, the hinge letting out the same soft, familiar creak it always had, and Celeste paused for a moment, studying the worn seats and the small scratches along the dashboard before finally speaking. "You really have no intention of ever trading it in?" she asked, something close to fondness threading through her voice. Gideon shook his head. "No," he said simply. "Why not?" she pressed, genuinely curious now rather than judgmental. He looked at her for a long moment before answering, his voice quiet but certain. "Because this car took me to places money never could," he said. Celeste smiled, and without another word, climbed into the passenger seat beside him. They pulled out of the garage together and merged into the flow of evening traffic, the city lights beginning to blur past the windows as the old engine hummed steadily beneath them. Behind them, in the hotel they had just left, a small group of executives stood near the entrance, watching the faded silver car disappear into the night with a kind of quiet reverence none of them would have believed possible months earlier. The man they had once dismissed without a second thought was now spoken of in hushed, respectful tones throughout every boardroom he had ever entered, referred to now by a single word that carried more weight than any title ever could. Chairman. It was a name none of them had chosen for him. A name that had simply attached itself to the man once the truth of who he was became impossible to unsee. He never asked anyone to use it, never corrected the ones who still called him Mr. Mercer out of habit, never once seemed to care whether the room addressed him as anything at all. Titles, he had learned long ago, meant far less than the quiet certainty a person carried into a room without needing anyone's permission to feel it. Somewhere in that transformation lay a truth few people in that industry ever fully learned, no matter how many deals they closed or how many fortunes they built along the way. Some people drive expensive cars because they need the world to notice them, to confirm through gleaming metal and roaring engines that they have arrived, that they matter, that they deserve the attention constantly chasing after them. Gideon Mercer drove an old, faded car through every version of his life because he had never once needed the world's permission to know exactly who he was.